remarks from our panelists and an initial discussion, and then move into our Q&A portion of the event. If you have questions for our panelists, please write your questions in the Q&A function with your name, your office or affiliation, and for whom the question is for. We will then try to get through all of the questions by the end of the hour. Second, this webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be made available on our website after we wrap at bluegreenalliance.org. With that, I will pass it over to our Executive Director, Jason Walsh.
Thank you, Brennan. Before we get to the briefing at hand, let me take a moment to recognize that yesterday we lost a champion of working people, Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO. Rich began his career fighting for the rights of mine workers, as many of you know, and rose to the head of the AFL, where he spent every day lifting up the voices of working people to ensure that their work is fairly compensated and their jobs are healthy and safe. He has my organization's and our partners' undying gratitude, and he will be sorely missed. So on that somber note, thank you for joining the BlueGreen Alliance for today's briefing on a topic Rich Trumka cared a lot about, as does President Biden: how we can ensure that investments to build back better translate into good union jobs and a stronger American manufacturing base in the clean energy economy. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of BGA. I am joined today by an excellent panel of labor leaders and policy experts. Mike Monroe, Chief of Staff for North America's Building Trades Unions; Roxanne Brown, International Vice President at Large for the United Steelworkers; and Jesse Jenkins, Assistant Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University, and the author of a recent study on high-road labor standards in the clean energy economy. For those of you who don't know us, BGA is a partnership of labor unions and environmental organizations. It's our foundational belief and guiding principle that Americans should not have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. We can and must have both. We are now in a unique moment to embody that principle in the policy choices we make. We can address the climate crisis and create good jobs and a more just society as we work to rebuild our economy and recover from this god-awful pandemic. Over the last decade and right now, we are witnessing, some of us are living through, the worsening impacts climate change is having in our communities. The science is unambiguous. We must get to net zero emissions by 2050 and ensure we're solidly on that path by 2030. As we've worked to drive down emissions, we've seen examples of how clean energy investments can spur economic growth and high quality job creation across the country. For example, a unionized crew of tradespeople built the Block Island offshore wind project off the coast of Rhode Island. Union auto workers on factory floors across the country are building cleaner cars and trucks. And workers in cities like St. Louis and Los Angeles are gaining access to high-skilled jobs in energy efficiency retrofitting, in pipe fitting, and in transit manufacturing. But we are not moving nearly fast enough to make the necessary investments to meet our climate goals, and not enough of the new jobs that have been created or promised in the clean energy economy are high-quality family-sustaining jobs. Today, we are releasing a report, as Brennan said, Making Clean Deliver, improving clean energy job quality and growing the clean energy manufacturing supply chain in the United States, which analyzes the current landscape of clean energy jobs in this country and how we can make them better. We think this report is particularly relevant right now as Congress debates federal clean energy tax policies as part of budget reconciliation legislation. And in particular, how these policies can be designed to ensure we are deploying the technology needed to meet our climate goals while ensuring jobs created in clean energy sectors are high quality union jobs and that investments drive growth in US manufacturing. We can do this by extending and strengthening key clean energy tax credits and coupling them with high road labor standards as well as Buy America policies to spur utilization of domestically sourced materials and clean energy projects. We have a range of policy tools that are proven for raising wages, building career pathways, and increasing access to good construction jobs. Prevailing wage standards, registered apprenticeship programs, as well as project labor and community benefit agreements, which often include local hire provisions, targeted hire of low-income or disadvantaged workers, and the creation of pre-apprenticeship pathways into long-term careers in the building trades for these workers. Attaching these tools to public investment in clean energy can help ensure that these investments translate into good jobs and careers that are accessible to all Americans. Policymakers must also ensure that taxpayer dollars translate into domestic manufacturing to produce the components and materials that go into these projects. Countries around the world are rushing to capture the manufacturing and jobs benefits of the global shift to clean energy. But too many of the solar panels, solar components, EV components, and parts and materials for wind turbines are manufactured overseas and imported, sometimes under deplorable conditions. Decades of bad policy, offshoring, and outsourcing have weakened supply chains and cost American jobs. We need action and investments now to rebuild these vital supply chains, grow jobs in our country, and position US manufacturers to lead the world in the most important global economic race of our time. This includes policies that both increase the demand for domestically produced clean technology, like Buy America, as well as supply side incentives to grow and support American manufacturing and supply chains. And we can target all of these investments in ways that help ensure equity by maximizing the benefits of job growth in clean energy sectors for low-income workers and workers of color, as well as for communities disproportionately impacted by pollution, deindustrialization, and energy transition. Finally, we can do all these things while still meeting our climate goals. You will hear from Professor Jenkins about his recent research that finds increasing wages for workers and increasing domestic content will not appreciably increase the cost or slow down the pace of solar and wind deployment. While wages in these industries would see, workers in these industries would see significant benefits, including billions in higher wages and hundreds of thousands of new jobs. The bottom line is this: we have the opportunity to make strategic investments in clean energy in ways that ensure the jobs created are good jobs, that the investments deliver gains for American manufacturing, for workers, and for communities, which in turn can build a political coalition of stakeholders that can endure over the coming years and decades, because we're going to need it. With that, I'd like to hand the mic over to my good friend, Mike Monroe, Chief of Staff for NAB2. Mike?
Jason, thank you. And thank you all for joining today. I'm pleased to join you on behalf of North America's Building Trades Unions. As Jason noted, I'm Chief of Staff. And I would also like to echo the comments that Jason said at the top. Yesterday, we lost our friend, our brother, and our leader of the American labor movement, Richard Trumka. And I see no better way to honor his legacy than to continue this work, continue this conversation, and ultimately arrive at a policy framework that puts workers at the center of our energy renaissance. For those of you who are not aware, North America's Building Trades Unions represents nearly 3 million craft professionals in the United States in all manner of occupations in the construction industry. And our focus on this and our top priority for the 117th Congress is to ensure that the deployment of clean energy technologies fostered and supported by, financed in whole or in part by the federal government, again, maintain strong labor standards. We are not climate science deniers. We are eyes wide open on this, and we are partners in that fight. However, we will always lead with workers at front of mind. And given our experience in the recent decades and years of clean energy technology deployment, far too often, these investments are not made with an eye towards how they will affect local communities, disadvantaged communities, folks in the middle class, and those seeking to enter it. We have a world-renowned training infrastructure that we are anxious to wed to these federal investments that will also trickle down to state and local investments, and that will maintain a floor for standards and set the goal high for the next generation of skilled craft professionals that will be building this critical infrastructure. Our position is very simple and clear and consistent. As I said at the top, our position is that labor standards should be accompanied by any financing that's engineered by the federal government in whole or in part for construction activity. So some of the labor standards that we're looking at, and we will obviously discuss at detail pursuant to your questions. We of course are looking for a baseline of prevailing wage standards to apply. We want to ensure that there's neutrality agreements up front. We want to make sure that we're looking for local hire policies to attach to this, registered apprenticeship, and of course, Buy America provisions. I will also note, given our focus on the construction industry and the rampant use of misclassification, we want to make sure that the ABC test applies so that those are truly employees are treated as such. I am encouraged by the work that we and our partners have done, including BlueGreen Alliance. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Roxanne Brown from the United Steelworkers, who's been at the forefront of these conversations for decades. And as Jason pointed out rightly, this is a moment in time that we think the stars have aligned, where leadership can put together a policy framework that will assuage concerns of distressed and anxious communities about their place in the future of our economy. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Pleased to be here. Pleased to be joined by my colleagues and appreciate their work on this front. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mike. Let me now introduce my friend and International VP at Large for the Steelworkers, Roxanne Brown.
Thank you, Jason. And many thanks to Senator Casey and Congresswoman Sanchez for hosting this briefing. I know they couldn't join us today, but much appreciated. And, you know, I also want to join my brothers, Jason and Mike, in acknowledging the passing of a giant, not just in the labor movement globally, but just a giant period. Rich Trumka yesterday. Rich believed that workers had to be at the center of this conversation that we're having today. And he knew that we were on the precipice of workers leading the growth of this clean energy economy that we're talking about. So we continue that work in his honor and just acknowledge the great path that he blazed for all of us in this conversation. So, you know, we're talking about clean energy job quality, and this conversation has been happening for many years and has taken on different iterations. But the goal of our union and the labor movement has really always been the same, and that has been to help shape and advance worker inclusive clean energy policies. And as a union that represents workers literally across every sector of the manufacturing spectrum, I often say that we are the union of everything because our members make everything that you can think of when it comes to manufacturing. We've spent much of our policy focus for decades on those policies that help to bolster, revitalize, and grow domestic industries like steel, aluminum, and cement. Domestic content preferences, or Buy America, that Jason mentioned earlier, is one area where we've done a lot of work to expand and improve on policy intended to encourage the use of the products and components that steelworker members make across our country every single day that go into infrastructure systems and others. There is huge bipartisan support for these sourcing policies and for the principle that American infrastructure investments should support American manufacturing through the use of domestic content preferences. Last year, at the start of the pandemic, actually, the Alliance for American Manufacturing commissioned a survey of registered voters that showed 80% of voters support Buy America for taxpayer-funded projects, with 55% strongly supporting. Only a very small portion, about 15%, oppose this type of policy. So the lion's share of voters support Buy America policy. And when it comes to privately funded infrastructure projects, 75% of voters support that Buy America should apply there as well. So procurement policies are not new. They've been applied to infrastructure investment through direct federal procurement and federal assistance for decades, and have ensured that investments maximize domestic production and jobs. And domestic sourcing standards really are critical as Congress works through its infrastructure packages. We're talking about clean energy tax policy being a part of these big, once in a generation infrastructure packages that are massive investments in our country, in our environment, and in American workers. But the only way we effectively help American workers and grow family sustaining clean energy jobs is by ensuring that we build the types of policies that are essential to achieve that into these package. And one key piece is attaching domestic content standards to clean energy technology like tax policy. For too long, the clean energy supply chains have not benefited from Buy America because these policies they've not been applied to the primary federal financing mechanisms for these projects, like the investment tax credit for solar and the production tax credit for onshore wind. And the policy posture has been to grow the clean tech sector in the cheapest way possible. But the cheapest price cannot be the sole consideration, because right now far too much is at stake economically for millions of workers who need to get back to work as we emerge from this pandemic. And they need to have access to jobs that will sustain not just themselves, but their families and their communities through the tax base that these jobs generate. So we have to balance that inherent tension in a way that achieves the critical goal we all have in building our economy back better. So there's a huge opportunity to change this when Ways and Means considers the Green Act. And, I know we'll talk about a bit more about that as we go. Senate Finance did this when they reported out their Clean Energy for America Act. And, we so appreciate the efforts of Senators Casey and Brown, who, included an amendment in this package that addresses this gap in Buy America and applies domestic content preferences to clean energy tax credits. So the work is moving in the right direction, but we need to take it over the finish line. And I just want to close my remarks by giving a special Steelworkers shout out to Congressman Boyle for his support of maintaining and expanding a domestic clean energy industrial supply chain. He has a USW represented facility, Cleveland Cliffs, and his district in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. And it's facilities like those that would really benefit from building out a clean energy supply chain. So thanks, Jason, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Roxy. And we will now turn to our final speaker, Professor Jesse Jenkins from the Andlinger Center. Jesse?
Hey, thanks. And thank you to Senator Casey and Congressman Sanchez for having me today. Before I begin, I have to issue the disclaimer that anything I share here today is my personal view and the results of my research, not a representation of Princeton University's views. But I'm happy to be here today to share some of the results of our research along with Dr. Aaron Mayfield, who's now assistant professor at Dartmouth University, to look at the implications of higher road labor standards in the solar and wind supply chains for both American workers and for the clean energy transition. This work builds off of the Net Zero America study that I hope some of you have seen already from Princeton University that was released in December, which worked to outline 5 distinct technological pathways, all of which could reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 across the whole US economy, while using technologies that we fundamentally know how to build today, right? We're not requiring any breakthroughs in science or innovation, although those will certainly help us expand our toolkit, and all of which are affordable as well. We find that a transition to a net zero emissions energy system would involve spending on energy services in line with our historical spending as a share of economic activity, or between 4 and 6% of our GDP each year, versus about 5 to 8% spent on energy services during recent prosperous periods of US history. In other words, we can transition to a cleaner energy system without requiring something like a World War II style mobilization of our economy where we invest 20% or 30% of our GDP. This is about spending the same or less than we have historically, but investing those resources in a wiser way. We also find that this transition delivers enormous public health benefits by cleaning up the major sources of air pollution across the country, from power plants to cars and trucks. That would save around the order of 11,000 to 13,000 American lives each year as of 2030, and avoiding a cumulative 260,000 to 410,000 deaths between now and 2050. The public health savings of this transition alone, which would be valued on the order of $2 to $4 trillion, would be in line with any cumulative incremental costs of using cleaner energy to power a more prosperous and healthy America over the next 3 decades. So this transformation is significant, and we cannot transform our energy system if we don't transform our energy workforce as well. What we find is that overall, the transition to cleaner energy sources results in a net increase of on the order of 500,000 jobs by 2030 and on the order of 2 to 3 million jobs by 2050. As increased employment in solar, wind, electric grids, transmission distribution, biomass production and refining, conversion, CO2 pipelines, and other emerging sectors, growing sectors, offsets slow but eventual job losses in the fossil energy sector. The question is, what kinds of jobs will these be? And will they support sustaining family wages for workers across this supply chain? So building on the Net Zero America study, Dr. Mayfield and I worked together to try to understand what would happen if we were to increase either domestic content shares in the solar and wind sectors or to increase wages and compensation across domestic employment in these sectors. What we found is that increasing compensation in these sectors and increasing domestic content shares results in very modest increases, perhaps surprisingly for some folks, in the final installed costs of utility solar or onshore or offshore wind projects. As an example, if we were to increase labor compensation by 20% across the entire domestic supply chain, including installation labor for utility scale solar projects, we estimate that that would increase the cost of solar projects today by about 3%. So while we see a 20% boost in wages, which would be on the order of $12,000 of annual increased income or compensation for workers in the sector on average, we'd see only a 3% increase or a few cents per watt of installed solar projects. Additionally, today we have relatively low domestic content across the solar sector, with only about 11% of module assembly in the US and about 38% of cell manufacturing, with virtually no polysilicon or wafer manufacturing in the US today. If we were to increase the average domestic content production in the United States by 10 percentage points across the supply chain, that would potentially increase the costs of installed solar projects by only 7%. In the process, it would create tens of thousands of new jobs across the domestic supply chains. When it comes to wind, there's no particularly appreciable or discernible increase in domestic costs for wind manufacturing relative to imports. And that makes sense because we produce about 77% of the wind turbine components, nacelles, towers, hubs, and blades within the United States today. And so we are already competitive in this sector, and we have a significant US manufacturing base. But if we were to increase that domestic content again by 10 percentage points and pay 20% more across the entire wind supply chain, we would see the cost of wind farms go up by only 5%. So again, we're seeing significant benefits across the domestic economy with modest increases in the cost of installed wind and solar projects. So there is a trade-off here, right? But it is perhaps nowhere near as severe as is commonly assumed between high road standards for employment or domestic content and proceeding towards our clean energy goals in an affordable manner. And in fact, the scale of these potential increases in costs is certainly in line with the level of public support that these technologies have received, or the potential increased support that is being considered under certain legislation today. So what's the influence of these high road labor practices and policies on employment outcomes? If we were to increase the domestic manufacturing shares for both wind and solar across the domestic supply chain by 10 percentage points, we would see an additional 45,000 jobs created across the economy, primarily in manufacturing and related sectors annually in the 2020s. And if we were to increase wages by 20 percentage points across the current domestic manufacturing or domestic content share and supply chain, we would see an increase of $12,000 to $13,000 annually in wages per worker for the solar and wind sectors. So if that provides useful context for these discussions about potential ways to promote a higher road labor standards and outcomes that benefit both workers across the sector and accelerate our transition towards a cleaner, more prosperous, and more healthy energy system. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. We're now going to turn this into much more of a conversation, which I will do my best to moderate. And my first questions are going to be to Mike and Roxy. It's kind of a two-part question. And I'll ask you, Roxy, to answer first, and then go to Mike. Talk candidly about how your rank and file members view the clean energy economy today, and what the risks are of continuing what has unfortunately been the status quo, right? Which is making public investments with no attention to labor standards or domestic content standards. So Rox, could you take a crack at that?
I worry for you asking me that question, Jason, because I am going to be candid. You know, my brother Mike Monroe said that, you know, our union has been engaged in this conversation for a long time. We go back a long ways, all the way back to when we were saying green jobs and not clean energy jobs, right? Today, our members are completely disillusioned about what clean energy jobs are and what the clean energy economy is, because they have not been a real significant and active part of it. And largely because of our policies and the failure of our policies to connect both the labor standards that Mike has talked about and the domestic sourcing standards that I've talked about. They don't see any room for them. You know, every day they're getting up and we tell them, you know, the products that you make will go into, can go into wind turbines and solar panels and efficiency systems and all of these things, but they're not seeing that. And, in fact, they're seeing the reverse. And an example that we've talked about, a few times is our members at a facility in Ohio called Rotec make bearings. And they made these huge, massive bearings for the wind turbine, onshore wind turbine sector for a decent amount of years, about 10 years ago. That business went from here to here, where it's maybe 1% of their business right now. And largely because we've allowed bearings for onshore wind to be sourced elsewhere. So we've lost that domestic capacity to manufacture really at a large scale the types of bearings that we need for onshore wind and offshore wind, because we've ceded it to other nations. So that's been my members' experience. So when we are having this conversation with them, it's hard to have it because they don't believe us anymore. They don't believe policymakers anymore that this economy actually is for them. And so failing to do the types of things that we are all talking about today and attach these types of standards to clean energy policy literally fails American workers. And I want to repeat that. We will fail millions of American workers if we do not do what we're talking about today in terms of attaching these standards to these policies to create the types of jobs that sustain families, not just allows them to get by, and then they have to work 2 or 3 of those jobs. We're talking about one job that can sustain a family and a community. So Jason, I'm sorry. See, I told you shouldn't ask that question. See, sorry.
This is why I asked it. And you're a hard act to follow. But Mike, you want to take a crack at it?
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Roxy. I think, that pretty well captures it. And I would just say very simply, there's a lot of skepticism from our rank and file about clean energy deployment and the clean energy economy, so-called green jobs. I think we've had enough data and real world experience to know that a future that, and for shorthand, generally would be cutting the wages and benefits of construction workers is neither attractive nor compelling. And as Roxy points out, there's been a lot of promises. We hear a lot of rhetoric about our members and broadly the American worker being the best in the world. Well, we should acknowledge that and support them. And our members, our leadership, are solely focused on the economic well-being of our members and their families. And we are tired of seeing or supporting the status quo or public policy regimes that in essence take our members' tax dollars and accelerate a race to the bottom for standards in the construction industry, or purchase or subsidize the importation of solar panels made in China or elsewhere. We know we can compete. We know we can outpace the rest of the world. We are tired of the false choice between economic security for our members and American workers and the battle to combat climate change and corner a market that is accelerating and growing all around the United States borders. So we're looking for America's leadership here. We're looking for committed lawmakers to internalize the experience thus far for our members and those looking at what the future holds in terms of clean energy economy. And we think these modest standards give us a fighting chance. They do not guarantee us anything. We are in a competitive industry and in a competitive economy, and we know that, and we're ready to compete. We want a level playing field. We think these standards, speaking for the construction industry, are a modest first step in the acknowledgement, just as we heard quite compellingly on the campaign trail, and our members were attracted to this. We do want to build back better. The status quo will not work, and we are going to need committed lawmakers, supporters, many of whom are represented by offices on this call. And so I would surmise by saying there is skepticism, but there's hope, and they believe in their leadership to help forge consensus on a path forward for them and their families and their rightful place in the future of the clean energy economy.
Thank you both. Jesse, we appear to be maybe on the cusp, although it changes hour by hour, of passing a bipartisan infrastructure package. And we are moving to a next piece of legislation that would be moved by Democrats through reconciliation. That would include even stronger, more directed investments to shift our economy and meet our climate targets. Can you talk a little bit about why that is so important and the risk in terms of meeting our climate targets of not making those investments? Because I mean, let's just be honest, right? We are already hearing people who have participated in the bipartisan negotiations saying, well, maybe, right? Or 3.5 trillion, what about that deficit? Selectively worried about deficits. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, if we want to hit our climate goals here and transition to a cleaner energy system that, again, as I said, saves tens of thousands of American lives each year, and has the potential to increase domestic production and employment across the energy sector, we need to make that transition today. We are already behind effectively in the pace to get to net zero by 2050 or to a 50% reduction in emissions across the economy by 2030, as the Biden administration is committed to. And so we need transformative policy now. What we found in the Net Zero America study is that to get on track to net zero by 2050, over the next decade, we need public policy to unlock on the order of $2.5 trillion of additional investment in clean energy sectors. That's above and beyond what we found in our modeling would be unlocked by a current policy scenario. So that doesn't mean the federal government has to spend $2.5 trillion directly on wind or solar or clean energy manufacturing or transmission lines, but it does mean that additional public policy beyond what we have today and far beyond what's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill needs to be implemented in the next year in order to start unlocking those investments, and that investment needs to be sustained over the decade. And that involves hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in transforming our power system, including expanding wind and solar power, and the transmission system, all of which, again, have the potential to create good jobs, but only if public policy directs us in that direction. So the clock is ticking, and if we don't see policy passed this year, whatever form it takes, it's very unlikely that we'll be able to keep up the pace to get on track for net zero. We'll be falling further and further behind.
Thank you, Jesse. Roxy, let me turn back to you and let's talk about domestic content. The question comes up and has come up as we've had these conversations about domestic content standards. What do we make? I mean, some of this is, like there actually are some people who think we don't make stuff anymore, but there's also kind of a very legitimate question of, are we do we have manufacturers? Do we have workers who can make this stuff? And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that from a steelworkers perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Jason. And, so related to that, going into this whole conversation about infrastructure this year, because we knew everyone would be talking about infrastructure this year, we did a really deep dive into what we call our contracts database in our union, where we look at every single steelworker represented facility that we have. And we looked across each and every one of them to see what they make and how what they make lends to infrastructure broadly, and that includes energy infrastructure. And what we found is that, you know, our members are deep. They roll really deep and are everywhere across the infrastructure really system. And we make, you know, the steel, obviously, that we've talked about. We make the glass, we make the aluminum, we make the copper, we make the coatings that can be used to go on to wind technology and also solar technology. I mentioned road tech already, where we make the bearings. We make the basic products all the way to the components that are necessary for all of these systems. We literally make everything. And where we don't make the things that are needed, that's why we need policies like we're talking about right now to be a pull to bring those technologies and those components back here. If you build it, so this whole system of the clean energy economy that we're talking about, if you build a system and you build a system that supports domestic manufacturing, not only will you bolster the manufacturing that's already here, that's already being done by steelworker members, but you will attract additional manufacturing to make the additional things that we need to support the clean energy economy. Just Monday of this week, we announced a MOU that we signed with US Wind to manufacture, to have steelworker members. This will be steelworker members when this facility is up and running, about 500, manufacture monopiles for offshore wind. And the monopiles are what will keep the turbines secured to the ocean floor. A system has been built to a degree, enough to attract those types of jobs to the ground of a former Bethlehem steel mill in Baltimore that will be steelworker jobs. That's great. That's one piece of it, right? But the other piece of the system needs to continue to be built, which is all of the stuff that steelworker members get up every single day to make. That stuff needs to be sourced to go into our systems. Companies need to see that the US government and that also private investors and private developers are sourcing US made products so that we have more domestic capacity to supply the sector that is growing fast and furious. So, Jason, we make the things, we make a lot of things. This whole call plus some I could detail everything that we do, that we make, that could go into clean tech. But we make a lot of things that are essential to what we're trying to do here.
And Jason, just if I could add to that, I mean, we do make them, and I think it's a potential bottleneck if we can't expand that capacity to keep up with the accelerated pace of clean energy deployment that we have to be seeing if we want to be on track for these climate goals. So again, it's if we don't, we can when I run a model, right, it shows everything is nice and affordable and moves smoothly, right? So that's good. But if we want to make that model reality, there are a whole bunch of transformative changes that have to occur. We have to mobilize that $2.5 trillion of additional capital. We have to train the workforce that is needed to expand the sector, and we need to expand the supply chains that we need to produce the materials and manufacture products that go into these projects. And so, all of that has to happen in sync if we're going to be on track for this. And so if we have, if policies ignore pieces of that transition, it's going to create friction that's going to slow things down. And again, we're going to fall further and further behind that transformative pace that we need to be on.
Yeah. Thank you for that addition, Jesse. It's an important one, and thank you, Roxy. Mike, let me turn to you. As you know well, Senator Wyden's Clean Energy for America Act includes two really important labor standards: prevailing wage and registered apprenticeship utilization for all new and existing clean energy tax credits. That's a big step that NAB2 worked really hard with Senator Wyden to include. But could you talk a little bit more about other labor standards that we can use to drive deployment, particularly in the construction sector along the high road?
Yes, sir. Happy to, and thank you again. You point out correctly that, and we appreciate the work of Senator Wyden and his staff, who I think again have internalized much of what we've been discussing today and are trying to chart a path forward that again keeps workers at the center. And we acknowledge their efforts and greatly appreciate his leadership on this issue. We talk about prevailing wage. Again, it is a baseline. It does not guarantee that they will be unionized workers, but it certainly helps all workers, whether in a union or not, that are in the construction industry. These are market-based surveys. They reflect area conditions. And our experience has been, and the foresight of Congress has recognized that the tremendous power and purchasing power that the federal government wields can either maintain, increase, or lower standards. And so prevailing wage allows for a modest wage floor. It recognizes area conditions and does not seek to undercut that. Registered apprenticeship is the gold standard for professional development, for workforce development, and to meet demands of industry and ultimately our end users. We and our contractor partners in the construction industry and the unionized sector, we account for 3/4 of all apprentices in the construction industry. That is because it is a financial commitment on an annual basis that approaches $2 billion annually of private capital that we and our contractor partners invest into a sustainable system. The current generation of craft workers helps to fund the future generation of craft workers. This has existed for over 100 years and has met the demands of industry. What we find very appealing about this moment in time is that connecting that world-class training system to the work that we've done with our community partners and propping up and the expansion of and the prevalence of registered apprenticeships that are tied to apprenticeship readiness programs. We work with a range of community partners to make sure that investments that are made in the community, both public and private, large and small projects, increasingly are tying these apprenticeship readiness programs that are exclusively focused on recruiting communities of color, women, veterans into the construction crafts. We can marry our private work and our private investment, our private commitment to craft workforce development with public policy that can further these investments and draw down more to the benefit of the communities in which they are made. So local hire is another thing that we should be keeping in mind. And Jason referenced project labor agreements. Consider those an efficiency tool for you. How can we set markers? How can we make sure residents of the local community are getting opportunities? How can we make sure that those apprenticeship readiness programs I mentioned are tied and tethered to these investments and give people a pathway and a shot? So by putting high road standards and elevating standards, at least maintaining them and setting our goal higher, we will then allow to capture more of a market share, and we will then be able to attract skilled professionals into a rewarding career in the construction industry. We know that by lowering standards, lowering wages, lowering safety standards, et cetera, you're not going to attract talent. We have a moment in time where we think that these are appealing careers, but only unless and until we advocate for the betterment of these workers and their families. So there's a range of options, I will point out that, again, in the construction industry, misclassification is rampant. There was just another story locally in the District of Columbia and the DC area about how wage theft and misclassification is rampant. So we need to keep that in mind. Again, we have the experience of the real world. We have data, and we think we have public policy that we know can work. So there's a range of options, but the moment in time, again, that we have here is to connect these investments with proven structures like our workforce development system that will allow the next generation of craft professionals to flourish in the green energy economy.
Just
Thank you,
comment on
Mike.
the role of the productivity in this equation too.
Yeah, please.
Of course, this kind of training, right, is going to lead to improved productivity for the workforce. And I just want to emphasize that the numbers that I was citing in terms of the relative incremental cost of these of higher compensation assumes no increase in productivity. And of course, we've seen in states with prevailing wages that worker productivity is on the order of 14 to 33% higher, right? And so if we're talking about a 20 percentage point, hypothetical increase in wages, and we're seeing a roughly 20% increase in productivity when we see prevailing wages, then the net effect of that is actually zero, right? We can see productivity offset the higher compensation per worker. And that productivity comes through training, it comes through worker retention, right? Having the same people on the job for longer periods of time. And so I just think it's important to note that our analysis was assuming flat productivity, right? So changes in wages with no corresponding change in productivity. But that's of course not what we see often in practice, right? So the impacts we're presenting are really upper bounds, and even those are fairly small.
Yeah, I'd actually like to talk about that a little bit more from a climate standpoint. And Jesse, if you have any thoughts, or Mike, if you have any thoughts, because there's a direct link, I would argue, between productivity and the skills of workers and actually getting the emission gains that we need to get, right? The difference between a properly installed and maintained, let's say HVAC system, right? And one that is not properly installed and maintained at a climate level is the difference between the emission reductions that are promised and modeled and no emission reductions at all, or minimal emission reductions. So much so that actually in states like California, and we've done a ton of work on this, for the installation of certain energy equipment, we advocate for and have successfully won with our partners, skill certification requirements, right? To install this stuff, to make sure it's actually installed the right way so that we get the benefits. Mike, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Well, look, yeah, I think picking up on what you and Jesse had said, productivity and safety gains, we live in a very cost conscious environment and industry, and our contractors are trying to compete, and we want to make sure that they're successful and can compete. And so productivity needs to be factored in, which is again tied directly to their first class, world renowned training infrastructure. Safety incidents are down, right? So that's all money. Again, the pie, and Jesse's research has pointed out, the pie won't change. It's the overall pie won't. It's what kind of slice is going to be broken off for workers. And again, I mentioned project labor agreements. Everybody on these projects has contracts, suppliers, lawyers, Porta-John suppliers. Why can the workers not have a contract? And that's all we're talking about. Make sure that they're at the center of this. So absolutely, productivity gains must be accounted for. Safety must be accounted for. And our contractors have known this for over 100 years. For every dollar that they invest in workforce development, they're getting almost $3 in return on economic activity. So we know this works, and we want to make sure that lawmakers have this in mind as they're crafting public policy.
I want to talk a little bit more about equity, which Mike, you talked about a little bit, and we've spent most of our time on this call talking about the fact that we actually can drive big investments along the high road. That's kind of a macro level discussion, right? And I think we care just as much about the equitable distribution of those gains, right, across different groups of workers, different populations, and different parts of the country, right? So we're kind of lifting all boats here as we make this shift. I'm wondering if any of you want to comment on that, and Roxy, I'll give you first crack.
I support a lot of what Mike has already said in this space, but then I think just broadly with policy, just focusing the investments that we're talking about into communities of color, into communities that have been devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs. I mentioned the U.S. Wind facility in Baltimore. There used to be 30,000 steelworker jobs at Sparrows Point, Bethlehem Steel. For 70 years, it was an integral part of the community in Baltimore, 70 years. And then in 2012, that facility closed and was just one of a series of losses in manufacturing that really led to a devastated city with Baltimore. And so the fact that U.S. Wind decided to invest in that community is exactly what we want to see. And this gets to your point about equity, Jason. And while I was there, after we did this announcement, a brother from the NAACP came up to me and he asked this very same question. Sister, it's good to see you. Good to see you here in our community. Good to hear that 500 jobs are coming. are you going to be talking to our community? So, I think once the jobs are there, I think we have the responsibility as the labor movement. And Mike, you talked about the programs that NABTU and the building trades, unions have in place to try to, I think, engage communities of color and women. We have to do it also as a manufacturing union, so once those jobs are ready to go, we have to do our part to make sure that we're engaging the community too, because it's not just this policy piece where we're directing investment to these communities, it's also our engagement as a labor movement in the communities to make sure that we're making those connections to help make sure that we're ensuring that there's equity and there's parity as these jobs are created. And it's not just, forgive my crassness, but in a lot of these manufacturing communities where, and then this is always a push and pull between the environmental justice community and I think manufacturing, it's not just white guys driving in to the jobs at these manufacturing facility to make the wages that sustain families. It's everyone. It's women who look like me, women generally, Black, brown, and other. So there's policy work here that has to be done to direct the investments to these communities, but it's also work on the part of the labor movement to do our part to match up that policy work.
Thank you. So I actually want to turn to some of these questions from the audience, which are good questions. There are a couple of questions about state examples of implementing clean energy deployment with labor standards. I will just quickly take a crack at that. Yes, we have examples. We need more, and the federal government can be a model in this regard, but we have examples from Washington State, from Maryland, from New York State, of implementing things that sometimes they're called renewable portfolio standards, clean energy portfolio standards, with key core labor standards attached to them, which is exactly the kind of thing that we are proposing at the federal level, and we have a precedent for it, right, from some of our laboratories of democracy. There's also a question here of unionization in the clean energy economy. Are there good examples of union labor in the clean energy sector? And maybe on this one, since Roxy, you told the really compelling story of Sparrows Point being sort of reborn for offshore wind. Mike, I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about offshore wind from a building trades perspective and some of the signs that indicate that this is a sector we can grow the right way.
Thank you. Yeah, we've in recent months we've made some progress in communicating our value proposition to some of these developers that are coming. Now, again, because of where we are currently in our domestic capacity, we're looking at largely foreign operators that are looking to invest here offshore. And so we've been able to come to an agreement with Ørsted, Vineyard Wind, and others that pick up off the success of Block Island that Jason had noted. We have a memorandum of understanding, which means we will, at the appropriate time, negotiate a project labor agreement for the construction of those turbines. And so there are some promising signs, but I will say a lot of that coincided with, yes, we did have some industry relations that we were able to get audience with, again, these decision makers, and be able to relay our value proposition. But quite frankly, I think we cannot underestimate the tone and tenor and the leadership that has been articulated, the vision that has been articulated by the Biden administration and by several lawmakers that are represented by people on this call. So I think that there has been an acknowledgement that we do have to do more. We do have to build back better. And we're excited about some of our recent victories and relationship building that we have been able to forge with some of these developers and investors here in the United States. Again, we look forward to a time where all components are manufactured here, that these are domestic firms that are making these decisions. But by and large, we've seen some progress, but we're not all the way there. And that's why a continuation of this conversation, a continuation of promotion of sound public policy that again puts workers in the center of the conversation will help further expand some of the modest gains that we've been able to make of recently. So we're looking forward to that. And again, thank you for your support and the consideration of what we've been presenting.
I've got another question for you, Mike, and it's really about training. And you've already spoken to this, but let me ask you to kind of riff on it a little bit more. And the question is, how far behind are we on training for these jobs? And what more do we need to do to make sure they're accessible, particularly to disadvantaged communities or communities that have been underrepresented in the construction workforce? You can answer that however you want. You might want to talk very briefly about the multi-craft core curriculum because I think that's an important piece. But take it wherever you want.
Yep. And I think that we've had this conversation where people have asked, well, these are new technologies. Can you do this, do that? If you can imagine it, if you could draw it up and you think you can engineer it, we can build it. And our apprenticeship system ensures that we can meet the demands of the industry and that we are up to speed on the latest and greatest technologies and how they're being applied in procurement and the development of projects, physical or otherwise. There is, as Jason noted, our apprenticeship readiness programs use a certified curriculum, multi-craft core curriculum that gives them an introduction into the crafts, gives them life skills, prepares them for the rigors of registered apprenticeship. Construction industry is dangerous, demanding, but rewarding work if done right. And so we think there's a moment in time, particularly where there's much discussion about the cost of college and coming out with debt that you are saddled with for perhaps several decades. We know we are potentially the alternative to college. That does not mean we train our skilled craft professionals at the exclusion of college. They can also receive college credits through our programs. But we think we are an attractive alternative. But we cannot attract the next generation of skilled craft professionals with low wage, high risk, unsafe occupations that they cannot support a family on. And so the training allows the worker to be more valuable. Their health and safety, of course, their productivity then directly correlates to the bottom line of the contractor and our owners and customers. So we're proud of the work we do. We're even more proud of the work that we've been doing and have accelerated exponentially over the last decade or so to reach into communities with partners such as Youth Build, Urban League, NAACP, Catholic Charities, and the like, to help recruit and communicate directly to some of the communities that we have not had roots in, to say there is a path forward in here and we are opening our doors. Now, again, the more that we can make customary and routine high road standards that allow for a level playing field of competition, we will then be able to recruit and train based on that demand. And so as we increase our share of the pie, we then can recruit and train like never before. And so the intersection of all these considerations in public policy, again, we are excited about the moment here because we think a lot of work, I've worked with Roxy and Jason for years, and we think that this is a culmination of a lot of work that if we seize this opportunity, can set us on a course, change the face of the construction industry, and really change the face of the American worker.
We're almost at the hour. Final thoughts, closing thoughts from our panelists. We'll go to you, Jesse. Keep it brief if you could.
I just think that this is the moment with a really unique moment with climate and clean energy policy embedded solidly within an economic policy agenda. That's been the first time this has happened really since the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, when clean energy was a tiny piece of the overall pie. This is a huge opportunity for the economy, and I think it's appropriate that we are thinking about achieving economic goals at the same time that we're thinking about achieving climate goals. And we're thinking about the equity implications of this, the implications of these policies on addressing inequality across the economy. So we have an opportunity to do all of those at once with the forthcoming legislation and Build Back Better policies. And so I think it's exciting to see that. And I hope our research provides some foundation, some quantitative foundation for some of the trade-offs and opportunities that are inherent in the current political moment and policy moment.
Roxy.
Or I'll just say briefly that, policymakers and all of us can effectively walk and chew gum at the same time. We can get at the goals that we've all been talking about this morning in terms of climate and clean energy, and we can create and maintain family sustaining jobs. We can we can do it. And so I appreciate the conversation and look forward to us getting this work done together. Thanks.
Mike.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to my co-panelists. Again, a pleasure to be with you all. And thank you all for your time and joining us today. Again, we're looking for leadership. We appreciate the work that many of you have done to get us to this point. We appreciate the work on behalf of NABTU and our affiliated unions, the support of over 200 members of the House that have agreed that the future of clean energy deployment must have workers at the center, and we must have a baseline of labor standards attended to these investments. We know then that they will pay for themselves over time, and they will be rewarding for the workers who are actually making these productivity gains for us and our entire economy. So please consider us a resource. We'll be available at any time for you or your boss if we'd like to discuss any of these matters further. Sincerely and humbly, thank you for your work to get us to this point, and we're excited about the work to get us over the finish line. Thank you all.
We are at time. I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank the audience, particularly those of you who have been working with us to make the kinds of policies we've been talking about on this call a reality. So thank you all. We look forward to working with you over the coming months because we've got a huge opportunity, as we've talked about on today's call. And have a good weekend and stay cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Take care.